So this will be made public. So if you've got any concerns about this going to the public view, you need to be aware that we do put this up on our YouTube channel. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that all of us here in Australia are meeting on the lands of our First Nations people, land that was never ceded. In my case, I'm here in Albury on the lands of the Wiradjuri people, and I'd like to pay our respects to all First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'm very pleased to introduce my very good friend and comrade of many, many, many moons ago, Marion Maddox. And I can't resist showing a picture of us back in 1985.
Oh,
just after we returned from a crazy month together at the World Student Christian Federation Human Resources Development Program, which was held in Indonesia, in Prapat. And so, yeah, there's a few of us present today. There's Andrew Bernard, there's me, there's Robbie, Marion, of course, and then Mandy's the one behind the shoe, and a few other of the ASCM.
And I think there's also Carolyn Reid.
Indeed, Carolyn Reid and Russell Peterson.
Yeah, Russell.
And Llewellyn. Mm.
Oh, thank you, Michael.
Yes, now we'll stop that now. We'll take it away. So at around that time, I think Marion was the ASCM National Staffworker, or became at around about that time. Now she's an Honorary Professor of Politics at Macquarie University and a frequent contributor to the discussion on Christianity and politics. So today she's speaking on religion and current Australian politics. That sounds hot. So over to you, Marion.
Okay, thank you, Michael. What a lovely introduction. It's slightly scary to see how many of us from that photo are on this call. And so lovely to see so many other old friends on this call as well. Hello, Susan. So nice to see you. Haven't seen you for ages. Hi, Helen. Hello, everybody. I haven't done a PowerPoint because I'm terrible at PowerPoint, and you would spend a lot of time with me fluffing around going, oh, what am I pressing? I've got the wrong button. So I'm just going to talk. So I hope that's all right. And also, when I chose my topic, I was not really quite sure what I was going to talk about. So I chose an unduly broad title, which was religion and politics. I'm actually just going to talk about Christianity and politics. And I'm going to talk about the ways that the landscape about Christianity and politics has changed recently in Australia. And I hope to go for about 30 minutes and then have time for discussion. Is that about right, Michael and Mandy?
Sounds fab.
Okay. So there are, I want to look at four sort of broad areas. One is we've had a lot of discussion lately. Of course, we've got the first Pentecostal leader, I believe, the first Pentecostal leader in the English-speaking world, which is, of course, our very own Scott Morrison. And there's been a lot of media discussion about what that might mean and what significance that might bear for the shape of religion politics or Christianity politics interactions in Australia. And so I'll talk a bit about what I think about that. I'd be interested to hear what you think as well. And as well as the Prime Minister, of course, there's other politicians. We can think about the significance of the way that Christianity affects the political scene more broadly. And then there's, as well as politicians, there's Christian political activism outside of Parliament. And there's also the question of policy, the way that Christian churches and parachurch organisations work at the level of policy. So first of all, thinking about the Prime Minister, the faith of the Prime Minister is something that when I was kind of having my political formation at the time of that photo that Michael showed in the late 80s and early 90s, it was very, very unusual for Australian prime ministers to really mention anything about their faith or about their religious convictions. And that was kind of regarded as almost kind of a bit sleazy to talk about, or a bit, you know, like too American to talk about that aspect of a prime minister's life. And it's become more and more part of Australian political discourse, and people often talk about the Americanization of Australian politics with more of a focus on personalities and more of a interest in the private lives in all sorts of respects, and interest in the religious lives and religious beliefs of our leaders is one aspect of that. But it's not only a shift towards a more Americanized or more celebritization of political life, but also it has been partly driven by the leaders themselves. And of course, a big push of mover and shaker of that change was John Howard, who in office described himself not as a regular churchgoer or a regular practitioner. In fact, he used to say that religion was only a very small part of his life when he was in office. But Scott Morrison, by contrast, but Howard, although he described religion as only a small part of his life, he made religious allusions and religious positioning a significant part of his political persona. Scott Morrison is different. Scott Morrison has gone out of his way to have himself photographed in church, to talk about his faith, to talk about himself as a religious person. And so he said things like, "I have always believed in miracles," he said, when he won the 2019 election. And he's often narrated the story of how one of his daughters was conceived after his eldest daughter was conceived after a long period of infertility and struggling to conceive. And then finally, after they'd given up trying, she was conceived on the 7th of the 7th, 2007. And Annabelle Crabb was interviewing him and said, do you think God changed his mind? And Scott Morrison said, "No, I don't think he changed his mind. I think that was a message to me about who's in charge." So he kind of narrates quite very, very, very personal things, like even the formation of his family as acts of divine intervention, giving specific messages from God about specific things. When he and these are things that he's made very public, like he makes them a public part of his political persona. And before he took the leadership of the Liberal Party, he not only prayed himself, but got his parliamentary colleagues, his closest colleagues, and his family to pray from the book of Proverbs, chapter 14, that righteousness will exalt the nation. He's talked about his calling to be Prime Minister using the verse from the book of Esther, "for such a time as this." So he is not shy at all about kind of expressing his prime ministership or his understanding of his public role in quite theological terms, even though he doesn't like to be pressed about it and he doesn't like to be asked questions about it, but he likes to kind of express it in his own terms. So he is quite a kind of a change from the way that earlier prime ministers have talked about faith and their place in public life. When there was quite a bit of discussion about these sorts of expressions by Scott Morrison, a student said to me, "Well, wouldn't any," because Scott Morrison had said something about feeling himself called to do God's work in the prime ministership. And a student said to me, "Well, wouldn't any Christian who finds himself in a position of leadership think of themselves as doing God's work? You know, what's really actually so remarkable about that?" And so I've sort of been pondering that ever since. And I kind of concluded there are there are different ways that a person might think about that expression of, or that idea of being called to do God's work in a particular position, and especially a position of national leadership like the prime ministership. And one way would be to say, well, this is where I find myself by the will of the people, having been elected to this position, and I have to really hope that I'm doing God's will and try my hardest not to stuff it up, because we're all fallen. You know, that would be one theological way of framing it. Another theological way of framing it would be to think, I've been put here by God, and so whatever I do more or less is kind of almost by definition going to be God's will. That, like, God has put me here and that makes it God's will what I'm doing. So there's kind of a spectrum of ways that one might think about what doing God's will in a position of leadership means. And the verses that Morrison invokes when he talks about his particular interpretation of leadership, I think it's reasonable to say that they incline not right to the whatever I do is God's will line, but they sort of, he has a sense of, seems to reflect a sense of having a more particular kind of calling to the role. For such a time as this, the verse from the book of Esther recalls the idea that of a particular person being put by God into a particular position to do for a task. So the way that our current Prime Minister talks about himself as in relation to his faith is quite different from the way that previous Prime Ministers that we've had in Australia have done so. We've had a series of quite articulated, so I said that Howard was a sort of a departure on the part of Australian Prime Ministers in bringing faith to the forefront, but not his own faith particularly, because he didn't describe himself as a particularly religious person, but making religious allusions in his speeches and positioning himself in relation to religious organisations. But then we've had a series of other leaders. So Kevin Rudd was a very committed, religiously committed leader, and Tony Abbott. So it's not an unusual thing for recent Australian Prime Ministers both to be religiously committed and to talk about it, but they've talked about it in each of them have had distinctively different ways of talking about it, and Scott Morrison's is a different one again. Moving along, we can think about the ways that Christianity operates for other politicians as well. And last time when we were talking about Christianity and identity politics, one of the participants, whose name I can't remember, so sorry, from Canberra, joining us from Canberra, made the really important point that in Australia we don't tend to get the sort of really fundamentalist political movements getting expression in Parliament the way that, say, you do in America with the hard religious right, because we have compulsory voting, and that inclines Australian politics to a more moderate kind of centre. But what we do have in Australia, which we've been seeing quite a bit of lately, is religion playing a role within party machines, or within particularly on the conservative side of politics, within the ways that the parties operate internally. So we've seen the Christian right being a very active part, particularly of the conservative parties in Victoria and Western Australia, and attempting to take that role also in South Australia, but the South Australian Liberal Party blocked sort of Christian right branch stack. And this is quite an interesting development, because as all of this happens, as the electorate is getting more and more secular. Oh, sorry. Hi, Ros. Yes. Sorry about that. about forgetting your name, but yes, it's such an important point. Even as the electorate is getting more and more secular, in some ways, religious kind of affiliation or religious activism within parties becomes more intense. And there are various reasons why that might be. One is because having a church affiliation, and particularly the bigger the church, of course, the better this works, gives you a ready source of volunteers and potential members, and or looking at it another way, potential branch stackers. One person's branch stack is another person's participatory democracy, but it's a ready source of bodies on the ground. But another thing that I think is quite important that we don't pay enough attention to is that a religious affiliation kind of gives a politician a way of saying, I stand for something. So in an era when party philosophies, party ideology is sort of fading away, and it's harder and harder to say what the party's philosophies actually are, and they're kind of blending into each other. So the Labor Party is supposed to stand for collectivism and more egalitarianism, but they wholeheartedly embrace the neoliberal revolution, and the Liberal Party is supposed to stand for individualism and free markets, but here they are wanting to publicly subsidise coal mines. So what actually do the parties stand for? To be able to say, I have a religious commitment, gives a politician a way to say, look, I stand for something. And in an era when public cynicism about politics is very high, to be able to say, look, I'm not just here to do favours for mates or to have my nose in the trough or whatever. A religious commitment enables a politician to be able to point to a set of values. You know, we're always hearing about values. And so even a secular electorate, which might not adhere to those values themselves, can sort of feel reassured, feel comforted, feel like, oh, this is a sign that the politician that we might vote for has a tie to something beyond politics. My friend and colleague David Smith wrote a really good article a while ago pointing out that as religious conservatives keep losing policy battles, so he gave the examples of abortion is now legal across or decriminalised across Australia. Voluntary assisted dying is legal in Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, and most recently Queensland. But at the same time, the religious right is keeps winning elections. In at least federally, the religious conservative part of the Liberal Party is, well, Julia Banks said that the federal Liberal Party had become a Christian conservative cult, and in some states the religious conservative movement has been electorally quite successful. So David Smith's question was, why is it that that conservative movement, religious conservative movement, can be so politically successful, but so electorally successful, but so unsuccessful in policy terms? And one explanation, I think, is that the conservative religious connections are not necessarily about talking to the electorate. They're mainly about talking within the party and positioning in terms of intra-party politics. Where are we up to? Then the third thing that I wanted to talk about was, activists beyond the activism beyond the political realm, beyond the parliamentary realm. Recently we've seen a lot of activism on the part of, conservative Christian activists in the areas of anti-vaccination. So there've been groups of church leaders putting out statements like the Ezekiel Declaration and the Moses Statement, framing resistance to compulsory vaccination as a freedom of worship question, saying that churches should be allowed to let unvaccinated people attend public worship because freedom of worship is a fundamental right, and wanting to resist mandatory vaccination on freedom of religion grounds. And another area is the push for protection of religious freedom in response to the marriage equality decision in 2017. And then another area, especially in New South Wales, is the One Nation sponsored education bill that tries to wants to prohibit teachers from discussing gender diversity or gender fluidity in schools. And the common theme that I've seen in all of those topics is the question of authority. They're all, particularly when I read through the Ezekiel Declaration and the Moses Declaration, I was thinking, how would you theologize questions about vaccination and protection from illness? Well, I could think of all kinds of ways of thinking about it. You could think about love of neighbour. You could think about your body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. You could think about care for the most vulnerable, but none of those things come up in any of those statements. What comes up time and again is the question of authority and who's in charge and the relationship between church and state. And we're not going to let the government tell us what to do. We're not going to let ourselves be bossed around by the government. And it's really building up this picture of churches, conservative churches, wanting to resist being told what to do by the secular authorities. And that same strand or emphasis is also present, I think, in the questions about religious freedom and about gender diversity and gender fluidity. And in relation to religious freedom, the religious freedom campaign, it's been very interesting to watch how until about 2009, 2010, most churches in Australia, but there were some exceptions, but most churches in Australia actually opposed religious freedom legislation. They opposed it when it was a referendum question in 1984. They opposed broadening Section 116 to include religious freedom protection. They have consistently, they opposed extending the Human Rights Act to include protection of religious freedom. And back then, protection of religious freedom was framed as being about rights for religious minorities, like for minority religious traditions, like protecting the rights of Muslim women to wear a hijab on the street without being abused or spat at or that kind of thing. But once it became a matter of same-sex rights, gay and lesbian and trans people's rights, the discourse turned around very fast. And from 2010 onwards, once same-sex marriage particularly became part of the public discussion, that was when conservative churches and suddenly became advocates for religious freedom protection. And probably most of you know the fabulous Eleni Poulos, whose PhD thesis I just finished supervising. She did the most brilliant analysis of that in her PhD thesis, which is available online. So if you want to know more about that, I commend you to read her thesis. So those are the sort of areas where I've seen upsurge of political activism from the conservative Christian side outside of Parliament. And the thing that has struck me from observing this over time is this kind of continued fascination with the area of authority, with the question of authority. Who's going to be in charge here, church or state, God or government? And then the final area that I wanted to draw attention to in the relationship between religion and politics, Christianity and politics in Australia recently, is in the area of policy. And we've already touched on that a little bit by talking about the things, the policy losses that Christian conservatives have had over things like abortion and voluntary assisted dying. But there's another interesting area of where the religion-state relationship has a big policy implication, and that is in the area of outsourcing of what were previously government services. So in one of the big kind of unsung or not very often sung effects of the neoliberal revolution in Australia has been handing over huge swathes of what were previously government activities to private agencies, and the majority of those private agencies are actually church ones. So back in 2015, the economist and also former SCMer, Paul Oslington, calculated that more than half of Australian welfare activities were being run by churches, and that proportion has only increased with the NDIS, with the expansion of aged care. And then another whole area that Paul didn't touch on in that analysis, of course, is private schools. And more than a third of Australian students attend private schools, and more than 90% of those schools are Christian of one sort or another. So from Federation until the late 1960s, the number of dollars spent on by governments on private schools in Australia was zero. And from the 1960s onwards, it's been expanding and expanding, and it's now in the billions. And we now have a situation where some Christian schools, religious schools, are receiving more public money than similarly ranked or similarly resourced public schools in the same area. And so what we've seen is a massive shift of public funding, public resources from government activity to church activity, to the extent, and all this as the numbers of people who actually go to church falls and falls. So to the extent that, as Paul Oslington pointed out, very soon, if not already, most people's only contact with a church will actually be through encountering a church agency as a service provider rather than through taking part in worship or having a conversation with somebody about a matter of faith. There are all kinds of sort of equity and other implications of that shift, but I have probably now talked for long enough and probably tried to cram too much in. Probably it would therefore be time to stop and let other people have a go.
Why don't you just stop? Oh, we just had a new person join us. So yes, our crowd is getting quite big. So normally we're quite informal with our little bit of a chat and just let anybody run with it. We can remain a little bit informal, but if you do really want to have guaranteed chance to ask a question, you can always put your hand up and I'll make sure, using the little icon for the hands up, I'll make sure that you get to have your question. But is there anybody who wants to chat with Marion about her input? I can jump in because one of the things that occurred to me listening through all of your input is there is this real emphasis on conservative Christians and right-wing ideologies. And as I'm listening to that, I'm thinking about, my upbringing in the church and what the mainstream churches are doing in terms of influencing politics. And yes, there is an element that some of the mainstream churches contribute towards a more conservative wing of politics, but there's also a strong push, particularly on issues around human rights and refugees and, advocating for positive change that has come from the churches. So I just wondered, how does the mainstream church fit with politics as compared with the what I would consider, because I'm in a particular bubble, the loons out there?
Yes, so glad you brought that up. I have really concentrated on the conservative side, partly because that's where my research has focused, and partly because that's where we've had conservative parties in power for the majority of the last however many years. Now, that also is one of the shifts that we've had over the last couple of decades. So back when I was starting to take notice of this area in the early 1990s, if there was a religion and politics story in the newspaper, it would be like the discourse was about the public media story was about mainstream churches being advocates for social justice and for environmental justice. And so the kind of stereotypical story would be a bishop in a purple shirt sitting under a stained glass window saying we need more poverty relief, or we need more land rights, or we need more environmental action, or something like that. And that's one of the things I think that really changed with the Howard era, that John Howard perceived mainline churches as one of his major sources of criticism just before the 1996 election. I was trying to find a reference for it, but I couldn't quickly find it. But 100 church leaders signed a petition or an open letter criticising the government's, the Liberal Party's economic policies, and Howard really perceived that the 1993 election, the unlosable election with Hewson at the helm, had been partly scuppered by church criticism of the equity issues in the goods and services tax. And so he really went hard to try and neutralise church criticism. And he had a three-pronged strategy, which included telling church leaders to get back in their box and stop commenting on politics. And then the second prong was cultivating relationships with the more conservative denominations, and then the third, being seen opening Hillsong premises and that kind of thing. And then the third prong was building church agencies into government policy through things like contracts for welfare work. So all the things, so it made it harder for mainline churches to continue the sort of criticism that they had been doing because of then the risk of losing the contracts. And I was involved in some of those discussions at the time about, how far do we go with taking the contracts. All the things that you've been talking about, like environmental activism, Australian religious response to climate change, Love Makes a Way, the Christian refugee activism, those things have gone on, have continued into the present era. But they have somehow sort of ceased to be the story. Like the story now is the Australian Christian Lobby, which has a staff of 20 people just churning out these press releases all the time, making sure that its version of what a Christian line is the story. So I do feel like in public perception, the narrative of what a Christian position on public issues is no longer the Catholic social justice statement has just come out. It's now the Australian Christian Lobby says getting vaccinated is a personal choice, or it's sinful to believe in anthropogenic global warming.
Really sad. We've got hands up all across the place. So first of all, Ros, I think you just got in first. So over to you, Ros.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marion, for a really interesting presentation. Got a bit of a question. Do you think that in 2021, the religion of political candidates does actually influence voters significantly enough to win elections? I'm thinking of my own social group, which is not huge, and the Prime Minister's position on religion and being so open about his charismatic background tends to put people into two camps. Either there's no way I'm voting for someone that open about their Christianity, or I'm absolutely voting for someone that open about their Christianity. Is that widespread across the Australian population? Is there data on it?
I don't think there is any data on it. And I think, and it's quite like, I have sort of thought about how you might try and test that. I think there's a lot of mythology about it. There's this sort of belief that there was this story or this kind of idea going around that Labor was losing outer western suburbs of Sydney because it had lost the ability to talk to people of faith. I don't really think that people vote on religious grounds that much. I think people vote on, particularly in Australia, because we have a major party system, and we don't. You have to vote on so many grounds. You have to, you can't vote on if we had a system of minor parties where you were voting on very, very niche things, then religion might be more significant. But because you have to vote on such a wide range of things, I really don't think that religious commitment is that significant an issue. I think that parties are very easily spooked by the idea that there's this sort of religious undercurrent that they don't really understand and that might bite them. But I think they need to look a bit harder at what is actually driving people's voting choices. But what do you think, Ros? Tell me about what you're hearing from people in your cohort.
To be honest, I think it just reinforces people's preferences already. So those who would already vote Liberal have a stronger reason to vote Liberal, and those who would vote Labor who are atheists have a stronger reason to vote Labor. I think it's just another reason to entrench. I'm not sure it convinces the swinging voters who are really the people who decide the elections. But yeah, I don't know, like I'm genuinely interested in the question, because overseas it does sway elections. And I mean, it's probably no coincidence we've only ever had one openly atheist prime minister as well.
Oh no, we had actually we have had prime ministers earlier who she was not the first.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yep. Stand corrected.
Yeah. But she was the first in the period when prime minister's religion was such an interesting topic. But John Warhurst's paper on the faith of Australian prime ministers, he identified a couple of earlier ones who were happy to say that they were not particularly committed. But yeah, Julia Gillard was the one when we'd suddenly become so sort of worried about prime minister's faith, and also she got kind of caught up in the middle of the marriage equality issue, and wanted to kind of parade her credentials as knowing the Bible, and it got very complicated. We could go on forever.
Meredith, you've been waiting very patiently. Over to you.
That's all right. Thank you. Marion, thank you very much for your presentation. Just by way of introduction, I'm a minister in the Uniting Church, and I'm currently in a placement in Western Sydney, and my internet is really bad. So I hope you can hear me. I'm really interested in your comments about the fact that most people these days encounter the church as a service agency, and also the other comments that were made about advocacy. In the Uniting Church, we're having a lot of discussion about the future of the church, what the church of the future will look like, and they're two related but different things. So the future of the church, I'm thinking mainstream. And I would be interested in your comments about that. On the one hand, we are strong in service and advocacy, particularly in the Uniting Church. Catholics do it really well in certain areas, etc. But if there is to be a Christian presence that is not just the right-wing conservatives, where does the mainstream fit? What does the church have to offer? And is it only, and I value advocacy and service, but is that all we have to offer? What is our core business as the church? Do we offer worship and faith and discipleship and nurturing and growing people in a spirituality that is meaningful for them? Or do we just step back and provide service and advocacy?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think it would be very, very sad to just step back and say churches are going to become part of the bureaucracy of delivering services, and that's all they can do. And I also think there are actually problems with government handing over what were previously publicly sourced services to private agencies, and leaving it kind of up to the leaving it up to the luck of the draw, whether you happen to encounter an agency that's committed to equity or that wants to discriminate on the basis of religious commitment or sexuality or other kinds of things, as we having the debates about religious freedom protection at the moment, I can see more and more potential dilemmas coming up as with the privatisation of more and more services. The great thing about things being done by the government, whatever you think about that, is that we all pay for it, and it's all distributed, at least in theory, equitably. So I have personally some reservations about privatising more and more of what were previously public services to private agencies. We also know that churches are among the greatest flouters of industrial awards in the country. So there are industrial questions about it as well. And when John Howard and Tony Abbott brought in the large-scale outsourcing, that was one of the virtues that they advocated for, of why private provision was better, because it's so much cheaper, because it relies so much on volunteers, and you don't have to pay the people as much. So I know the big agencies pay their workers properly, but yeah, there are all sorts of questions about privatised delivery. So yeah, I think churches have special things that they do well, and I think it would be very sad to just step back and say we're going to become part of the bureaucracy. But I don't know the answer to your question, and if I did, I'd be out there saying it. What do other people think?
Marion, can I just comment that I think it's that very policy has backfired enormously on the church, in that the government doesn't now pay enough to run services appropriately.
And I think that, to be blunt, was always the intention.
So does the church have anything else to offer in the current social environment? What do we have to offer? Is anybody interested in more in the ideas of faith and worship and having a construct for life that takes us beyond ourselves?
Well, plainly they are, because people go, not in the numbers that they used to, but they still do, and people also look for those things in other sources, in other places. But I think the form that it takes is maybe going through an evolution at the moment. But I don't know whether Christianity will, I mean, we no longer have a Christendom kind of environment where we can expect that the majority of the population will worship together in the way that they, or at least we think that we imagine that they did in the past. But what form it will take in the future, I don't know the answer to that. I'd be interested in what other people think.
Well, just a thought.
Yeah, go ahead, Mandy.
In answer to Merida's question, I really like the formulation of Anne Wansborough many years ago, that we're involved in the services area because it's a way of keeping feet on the ground, serving the vulnerable, and being real for people, meeting people's real needs. But that can never be a replacement for worship, for prayer and all of that. It has to, but the two go hand in hand. Some people, I think tolerate the Christian churches because we are at least doing things for the vulnerable. And you do see mentioned very positively, for example, Bill Cruz's mission, that sort of thing, so that even though people have a lot of issues with a lot of Christian churches because what is said to be Christian has changed so much over the years, and is often presented as an Australian Christian lobbying, list agenda. But somehow our presence with the vulnerable does make a difference to some people, but it surely is a question of both and, not either or.
Can I interrupt there? I think it makes a huge difference. I mean, look, I'm a Uniting Church, and I think the Uniting Church presence on social issues makes a difference. I get people who don't come to church on a regular basis come up to me and say when they I mean, I work in social issues and family, give food out and do stuff, and people say, "Oh, you're Uniting Church. Oh, they're fantastic." I mean, they notice the social justice and they notice the social justice issues, and they notice what the church says. I mean, someone said today, "Oh, Uniting Church is going to make people be vaccinated." That's fantastic. I mean, down the street sort of thing. They notice the stuff that we do. I mean, I got a whole bunch of atheist friends, right? And they go, "Oh, your church is all right." Okay. I mean, they're all atheists, and they go, "Oh, your church is all," because of the social justice stuff that the church does, not in worship, not in stuff, but out, land rights or whatever, all the stuff that they're interested in, and it makes a difference, So I think it makes a huge difference.
Before I go to the hands up, there is a related comment from John Bretz. I don't know whether John Bretz is back in the room, but it's almost like which side is going to win. Where do you see the relative prominence of the parish arm of a mainline church going as a result of these trends, and which arm of the church may be on the rise? We do see these, what I would call a friendly kind of church that Susan's just described, but is the other side going to win at the parish level?
What do you think, John?
Sorry. I think you're on mute might be the most popular comment of the year. What I do see is the parish system is challenged, is probably it's suffering numerical decline. There's no doubt about that. I hear in the Anglican Diocese of Brisbane, there are 18 vacant parishes and 4 people in college training. So do the math, run that forward. You don't need to be an expert. And yet our schools are stronger than ever. I think the Anglican Diocese in Brisbane is one of the few Anglican dioceses that own all the schools. They're not separately incorporated. So they're basically like a big arm of the diocese. And the only one that's separately incorporated is owned by shares, of which the 10 shares are owned by the diocese. And there's a special piece of amending legislation that's meant to say you can't have a school owned by shares, and they're on a schedule to exempt them. And that was about potentially the private sector trying to privatise high schools. So quite a large diocese in Brisbane. I'm just sort of a humble deacon, that's all at the moment. I had sort of, been on the property and finance board, but I really think we're in transition to something very different. And I can't not go back to pulling back to the mega trends, the Christian home churches, the Desert Fathers, the attachment to Roman Empire and the rollout of Christendom. It's very significant. And the other thing is, we might say, we lose a parish here or there, but just listening, I was thinking, it's actually the way property rights are set up. Like, obviously the church was, the bishop can't have a couple of illegitimate kids and take all the property with them. Whereas here, our town planning schemes basically say, you've got a block of land, we're going to limit it. It might be a community purpose, and we'll charge you rates. And if there's no one around to pay the rates, then head office in whichever church would just go, well, sorry guys, and end up, moving it on. So, unlike Christendom, where they build like a stone church and you just say, even if the roof fell in, the walls will be up, and then in 100 years' time, someone will rebuild the roof and have another go. Just the way our property is set up in the parish system, it would be easy for that all just to be wrapped up and, so to speak, turned into childcare centres, to speak generically. I'm just wondering, where do you see that energy or the Holy Spirit popping out another way?
Well, if you're asking me, I don't know, but I think you're right that it's going to be something different. I think that it's like, I think we've been through a stage, and it's going to be another one. And another aspect as well is just mobility. Like people are not you're not walking to your church on the corner. You can drive to wherever, and so you have these kind of concentrations of people in the vast sort of mega church setups that attract people for a little while, and then they have very high churn. So people go for a few years and then move on to something else. And so there's not the kind of sense that you, and also the other big sort of shift since the 1970s is sort of the more consumer orientation towards religiosity, where you're looking for, what can this do for me, rather than what religion do I belong to. So I just think there's Sue says you can zoom in. You can zoom into anywhere. You can join church, and we could all go to church with you in Brisbane, wherever we happen to be. But it's going to be something different, but we don't know yet what it is.
You're right. The 70s, there was this transport revolution of personal auto mobility, and now we've got this internet mobility. It's going to be very different.
I've got 3 hands up, and I'm aware that it's gone 6, but Marion, I hope you're okay to stay for a little bit longer so that we can pass it on. So Robbie, you're next.
Thanks very much, Marion. One of the questions I have is the role of biblical theology, and it just astounds me that when I read the Bible, I get a very different message from it than from what the Australian Christian lobby get out of the Bible. And there's a sense of saving the world in the Bible rather than saving your individual soul. And so that sort of debate doesn't seem to enter into the public space very much. Like there's not really much debate about the meaning of theology. I mean, one interesting example in Australian politics was the Costello brothers, Peter and Tim, with Peter, I suppose, a renowned conservative leader, and Tim, an advocate for gambling reform and refugees, and so seeing how those sorts of challenges play out, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I guess the thing about ancient texts is they're polysemic. They mean a lot of different things. It's those of us who were brought up in the progressive traditions have a rich heritage of learning from the Bible about social justice, but to other people brought up in a more conservative tradition, it's equally transparently obvious to them that the Bible supports a different point of view. And so you don't get very far by just saying, look, it's self-evident that the Bible says this, but what we don't have in Australia is a strong tradition of having those kinds of discussions in the public space. And one of the things I've argued over the years is that we really need to do that more. Like we really need to have not less religion in politics, but more, in the sense that when politicians allude to religious or Christian reasons for taking particular policy stances, we all need to be able, whether we identify with a Christian tradition or not, all of us need to be able to say, well, hang on, why do you say that? What actually is the justifying theology of your position? And give us an explanation, give us an account, the same way as we do about their economic policy or their view of history or any other part of their philosophical presentation. We need to be able to say the same thing about ask them the same sorts of things about their theological assumptions. And that I think it's partly that our journalists have not been kind of trained or confident in asking those sort of questions, but I think that we all need to be able to kind of raise that in public discussion and say, well, all right, then show us the money, show us how does your position on refugees fit with your theological statements that you've made in the past, that sort of thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be an answer that all of us would be happy with, but at least it sort of sets the ground out.
Dig deeper behind the statements. I like it. Helen, you're next for a question. Helen over in East Timor.
I am, yes. Greetings from Dili, everybody. I've been out of Australia for about 5 years now, and, you know, this discussion sort of, you know, makes me wonder whether things are still the same in Australia as they were when I was living there. But, and also partly because of the pandemic, I've taken to joining a few Facebook groups, and also Zoom meetings. Now, I want to ask Marion in particular to try and define what you mean by a mainstream church and whether it includes the Sydney Anglican Diocese, because I have recently joined a Facebook group called Christians for Labor. Having been a Labor Party member for years, I worked for John Langmore in Parliament House, and I was on a policy committee with Brian Howe, and have sort of been familiar with this sort of, you know, Christian socialism, well, I like to call it. But I've joined this group called Christians for Labor, and I find that it's most of the people are in the Sydney Anglican Diocese and in the ALP right-wing faction. And I don't know, you know, I mean, the purpose of the group is I guess, to make people realise that not all Christians vote Liberal, which is, and they take on the Christian lobby, the Australian Christian lobby, not on their policies so much, but on what because they tell people to vote Liberal. You know, they're obviously getting set up to get people away from the Labor Party. And I just wondered whether anyone else in this group, I mean, because a lot of you are from New South Wales, and this begins to make me wonder, is there a big Victoria, New South Wales difference that I was unaware of when I was living in Victoria? I don't know, Marion, and I think actually, Marion, last time I saw you in the flesh was in Melbourne, and you were giving a talk about at the Melbourne Town Hall about religious education. And I think the point needs to be made that Australia suffers from a huge amount of religious illiteracy. People who are not part of churches have not a clue what the difference is between a mainstream or mainline, they call them in the USA, and a fundamentalist or a conservative evangelical or a Pentecostal or whatever. And a lot of people in the churches don't either. And then now, because we've got this growing split between the economic left and right and the social left and right. In other words, you've got strong trade unionists who are strong on wages, etc., but who are anti-gay, anti-feminist, and it seems to me that this group, I shouldn't be maligning them too much, seems to be trying to put across the view to the Labor Party that if you want the Christian vote, you've got to stick to social conservatism. A lot of the members of this group would think that. I mean, not all, but that's unfortunately my view. Now, I'd like your comment, because you're an expert and a person living in Sydney.
Well, lovely to see you, Helen, and I vividly remember seeing you in Melbourne, and but this is amazing. I hadn't heard of the group that you're talking about, and that it is an alliance between the Labor right and Sydney Anglicans. That's all new to me and is causing me a bit of a head spin. I'll have to think a bit more about that. But
I mean, this is just my view. This is just my view as a socialist left person from Victoria. That's you know, I might be biased. I mean, obviously I am biased.
But it relates to what I was saying before about how there's this kind of mythology built up about how to be a Christian is to be a social conservative, and also that that Labor can only win if it sticks to a social conservative position. That is quite a sort of, you just keep seeing that line all the time, and it's part of the kind of culture wars backlash that goes with, as you were saying, that division between the economic left and the social left. But you're quite right, there is a strong Sydney-Melbourne division. There's a really good paper from a few years ago now by the just recently late Gary Baumer called The Tale of Two Cities, which is about exactly that. It's in the Australian Religious Studies Review, but then it changed its name to the Journal for the Academic Study of Religion, where he analyses the way that the religious climates of Sydney and Melbourne, between not only the different kinds of Anglicans, of course, which is the most prominent one, but also different kinds of Catholics, and also different just the different sorts of secularity that the two cities have as well, has influenced the political culture of the two cities. There is definitely a Sydney-Melbourne difference. Also, the fact that the Labor Party split in Victoria and not in Sydney, and so the Catholic right stayed strong in Sydney. So yeah, there's those distinctions go back quite a long way.
Thanks. Andrew, interested to hear your question.
Actually, I was just going to make a comment, but I think John has covered some of the same ground about the question of the future of the church. Obviously, it's not a small question, but whether it's going to see the balance between, or the emphasis on, congregational life versus the church as essentially a services arm with some theology behind it. I think that the direction of that is fairly easily read in the church attendance numbers and the trends over the years. I mean, congregations are inevitably shrinking and aging, not finding the renewal in most of the mainstream churches, at least. And I've certainly seen in the hierarchy of the Uniting Church, where I have been a member, that's kind of accepted too. I mean, the church hierarchy seems to be losing its interest in congregational life, and to some extent, and they see their future in in being a service provider with a social justice bent, essentially. I mean, I'll never forget actually the previous Minister of Pistrate, Margaret, when she had her induction years ago. It was actually Eleni Poulos that gave this the reflection at that, and the first thing she said in her service was, "The church is dying," which I thought was a really positive way to start things off for Margaret. But which I have to agree with her. The church as a grassroots movement is dying, and it's being overtaken by something else. And you know, those of us who have an interest in the spirituality of the spiritual life of people, you know, need to think about what the future is going to look like, other than being a contracted, outsourced service arm of the government.
Any response to that, Marion?
Well, I think you just kind of encapsulated this, what a number of people have been saying, Andrew. Yeah, you said it was a comment, not a question. I mean, I just reiterate what I said before, that I don't think people have stopped. Like we know, like as you said, the story is told in declining congregational numbers, but the other thing we know is that people don't stop. When people stop going to church, they don't stop believing stuff. Which is what sociologists of religion thought was going to happen. They thought that everybody would just become sort of scientific rationalists, but in fact, what has happened is that people's spiritual take on the world has become far more individualized. So rather than inheriting a theological tradition, people have a much more personalized, kind of cobbled together spirituality that is rather where once you would sort of aim for orthodoxy and aim to have beliefs that are similar to other Christians that you know, or other members of your community, and it would be the thing that makes you similar to other people. Now it's more a matter of your beliefs and what make you distinctive, and so you kind of patchwork together a little bit of what you remember from Sunday school, a little bit of what you got from the New Age shelf in the bookshop, and a little bit of the astrology column from the newspaper, and a little bit of what you thought of in the shower. This is caricaturing here, but this is sort of the trend towards spiritual but not religious, so-called SBNR, spiritual but not religious. Sociologists of religion like to use that acronym. More individualized kinds of spiritual identification. That means it's another reason why maybe congregational forms are harder to maintain, because people don't have the same hold on one another that they previously had, and so there is still a need for people to find ways of expressing those senses of connection to other people and to the divine and to the non-human world and so on. But what form it will take, we don't know. Well, I don't know.
Thanks. So, sorry, Susan, I did mute you because we're getting a bit of feedback. So over to you. You'll have to unmute yourself first.
Sure. So it's a bit like Marion. It's a bit like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we only had 4 channels on TV, and now we've got 36 TVs to choose from. Is that it?
Yeah, a bit like that, and yeah, and just multiplied over so many things, so many, yeah.
So Yeah, sorry, Marion.
I was just going to say there's one of those books that the subtitle, everyone remembers the subtitle because the subtitle's so much better than the title. The title is Religion in Britain since 1945, but the subtitle is Believing Without Belonging. And so everybody just remembers the book as Believing Without Belonging because that's what it's about. It's about the phenomenon that people believe all this stuff, all different stuff, but they no longer have a kind of a core tradition that they identify with or belong to. And yet it's like we can, as Sue was saying, we no longer all talk about what we watched on telly last night because we all watched one of, hundreds, potentially hundreds of different things. And Helen said, can I send a link to the article by Gary Baumer? Yeah, I can. What should I do? Email it to the group.
Yeah, just send it to me and maybe I can forward that on to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I think we're getting a bit over time. So is there any last pressing question or comment? In that case, maybe, I don't know if anybody wants to close with a prayer, looking at people who are better experts at this. Mandy?
Sure, happy to. But before we do that, could I mention that we're actually going to look at spirituality a bit more next week. It'll be a change of pace, but really we're doing this to revive the very sorts of discussions that we are saying are so important in our society. And religion remains contested space. And let's explore the important riches of our faith and be part of telling people the good news as we understand it. So next week we've got The Spirit of St. Francis is Alive, a conversation with some Anglican Franciscans, one monk and 3 Anglican women clergy. And that's Sunday, 26th 9th at 5 o'clock. So you're all most warmly invited. So to close with a prayer. Loving God, we thank you for minds to think, hearts to love, and imaginations to wonder. Fill us with your love. Grant us wisdom. Help us to see in the small and the frail and the vulnerable your Son, Jesus. Help us to live out his life with fidelity and faith. We ask these things in the name of Jesus, friend, Saviour, who walks with us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks, Marion.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Marion. Wonderful session. Really very inspiring and helpful for us all.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Well, thanks everybody. I really enjoyed hearing everybody's comments and hope I didn't ramble too much.
No, not at all. I can never get enough of you, Marion. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.